Alright, this is one I actually meant to do a few months back when I was kind of doing all those at once. And then for some reason it ended up getting kind of pushed to the side, but now, well, now we're doing it. Obviously, Heath Ledger's collaborations with Terry Gilliam. With the Brothers Grimm coming out in 2005, and then the Imaginarium Dr. Parnassus 4 years later, after we'd already lost Ledger, and this ended up becoming his last official movie. Despite how much they talked about The Dark Knight being his last completed movie. This was technically his last performance, and we'll talk about the interesting way that almost felt like it was meant to be, in a way, if that's also not too insensitive to say. Yeah, and another thing these two had in common that we'll get into also is apparently both had particularly troubled productions, speaking of that. But we'll get into the individual ones of those and start with, even though it came 4 years later, I want to start with the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, which is one of those movies that is immediately just sort of the embodiment of everything you would think it would be. When I was talking about, because you look at this and you see it's a Terry Gilliam movie about the imagination. And it's like when I was talking about Inside Out when it came out. How Pixar was a studio that has always kind of worked in emotions and getting like the most emotional response out of their audience they could possibly get. And Inside Out kind of felt like the embodiment of that because it was literally just them going all out and making a movie about emotions. Same thing with Gilliam making a movie like Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. It just sort of seems like the entire embodiment of everything he had worked up to this point. Just flat out making a movie about imagination itself. To the point that the main characters are true played by Christopher Plummer, Vern Troyer, and Lily Cole, and eventually Ledger, and Andrew Garfield, who I can't forget. Basically putting on this whole show, obviously a literal magic show, but also just this show in general that sort of feels like a really cheap stage production of a Gilliam movie, basically. So it all kind of comes together and fits perfectly. And as far as the cast list goes, Garfield is pretty much our main character until Ledger enters the picture. And it's worth noting this was 2009, before Garfield kind of really took off. And there was an interview, that famous video that was like Heath Ledger's last interview, where it's an interview for I'm Not There, but he talks mostly about The Dark Knight, and then he brings this one up also because he was in the middle of working on it. And he says something along the lines of basically predicting that Andrew Garfield was going to go on to big things, which he obviously couldn't have been more right about. And you can see that throughout this movie, and how you could see how he saw that so early. And then you have Christopher Plummer as our title character, and this was kind of like the sort of start of the rise, the re-rise of Christopher Plummer, the return of Christopher Plummer, like the spike in his popularity that happened around this time that's continued on to today, really. Where he had this, and he got his first Oscar nomination for The Last Station for the same year. And he was kind of working, I think, intermittently on these. And I kind of like to see this as like the start of that, the popularity that you see Christopher Plummer at now, today. Because prior to this, it kind of just went way back to The Sound of Music. But then this really kind of put him back on the rise, ultimately making him an Oscar winner only 2 years later. So there's that. And then you have Vern Troyer. And the really refreshing thing about this is it's interesting to watch Vern Troyer in not just a substantial role, but a role that doesn't make him a punchline. I mean, obviously there's, midget references here and there, and there's the whole thing about that's his character and people make those comments. But I mean, for the most part, that's not what his character is all about. Which I found really refreshing. And then, of course, Lily Cole was kind of she's one of those characters here where all she really needed was, the presence in general to evoke that whole sort of, I guess you could say, forbidden thing in Garfield's case, and then an innocence in Plummer's case, and then something to be desired in Tom Waits' case. And she's able to kind of capture all three of those with really I mean, the acting is fine, but like I said, really just the presence that she has throughout the movie just makes that work by itself. And then, of course, they eventually find their way to Heath Ledger, who is hanging by his neck from a bridge, despite the fact that he's got a pipe in his throat that helps him survive this. And the great thing that Ledger has to do throughout the movie is he has to be that really sort of charming character, and the character that sort of lures the other characters in and makes them believe his bullshit. But that's just the thing, is that it is bullshit. So we kind of see that sort of slimy con man side of him sort of slithering in and out throughout the movie. In these cases where we can still see him hiding it, but then as the movie goes on, it becomes sort of more and more clear to us. Hence more and more clear to the characters also, even if they're a little more behind than we are. Particularly in moments, I really love the scene, especially with how important it is when it comes back later. The scene where Garfield has the pipe we were talking about, and the way he's doing the sleight of hand to sort of, play games with him, but the way this is, it should just kind of be this really sort of fun, playful thing, but as Tony is reacting to this, we can kind of see the sort of darker side to him and realize there's definitely something he's hiding, and he's definitely not in the position that he says he's in entirely. And that he may have all the memories, or at least most of the memories of what came before this, and what it is he's trying to get away from. That could potentially be coming for all of them if he gets them enough into the danger. But speaking of danger, the danger that Tony's in seems very light compared to Dr. Parnassus, who has made a deal literally with the devil, who is perfectly cast as Tom Waits. And Tom Waits is one of those people where he just fits Gilliam to a T, but then when you say that, especially this role, but when you say that, you also realize that Tom Waits is one of those actors that seems to go with any director. Whether it be like Gilliam or Jarmusch or the Coen brothers or Martin McDonagh, Coppola, he's one of those people that just goes with, he's pretty much every time I see Tom Waits in a movie, he's always perfectly cast, and never more so than here. As a bowler hat wearing Satan that sometimes will take the form of a giant snake. And has always got his black umbrella, and it just always has this sinister quality to him. He's always looming over in the movie, and you never quite know when he's going to pop up again. He's like the shark in Jaws, only more frequent, and more charismatic. So the great thing I also love about this movie, apart from those characters, and just the stuff we'll get into later about the whole, all the Imaginarium stuff, is the setting, whether it be the time or the locations. Because what's interesting about a lot of this movie is it feels like it's in an older era. Whether it be them, being pulled by horses, or the way they're dressed, or the way the locations look, it feels like they're in a time that's like really long ago. But then there'll be like one detail that comes in that reminds you that we're in pretty much present day. Because we'll be really set in this scene and in this moment, and it, like I said, it really feels like we're in a different era entirely, and then suddenly, like, the cops pull up, and the second we see the red and blue lights, it feels immediately like it's present day, and then it's like this whole sort of juxtaposition on the whole setting and where we thought we were, or where it feels like we are at the time. And then, much more notably, after we sort of settle back into it, and it once again feels like we're in a movie that's in like the late 1800s or early 1900s or something, suddenly Tony's cell phone rings, and then we're pulled right back into I can't say we're necessarily pulled out of the movie, but we're pulled seemingly into another era, or in the era that we forgot we were actually in. And it almost kind of feels like we're constantly time traveling back and forth, just by the way the movie presents the time that it's set in, so I really love that. And the presence of the general store also really just like this almost jarring sort of contrast to what we've been seeing everywhere else as far as the setting goes. Which features Gwendolyn Christie, who I believe this was her first movie. She's only there for like a second. But speaking of the other actors in the movie, we talked about the main cast. Now we talk about how exactly they dealt with it when Heath Ledger died during production. And this, I think, even 10 years later, this whole thing will always be so eerie to me. But not in like a creepy way, but in like a sort of mesmerizing way. How it's almost like the way this movie is right now feels like it's the way it was always meant to be. Bringing in the other three actors, Johnny Depp, Jude Law, and Colin Farrell, into the movie to portray Tony inside the Imaginarium each time somebody else is in it. And each of them kind of have to give almost like a different performance of like a different sort of side of Tony's personality in a way. Which by the time it gets to Colin Farrell, when he goes into practically full villain mode. But the thing about this is that not only is it so sort of like completely cohesive, and like I said, almost feels like it was like the concept to begin with, but not only that, but it like adds a whole other layer to its concept. Particularly the scene where Depp has his Forever Young monologue. Almost feels too perfect, where it's not just where we see when she sees the pictures of Valentino and Princess Diana and James Dean, and it's the whole thing about, you know, dying young basically preserve them, like they'll never get sick, they'll never get old, and it's like he's talking about Heath Ledger in a way also, which is like I said, almost like you would think it would be this sort of eerie thing, but it's really just there's really just a perfection in it in the way they handled this. And hearing them talk about it also, like, and like how much they were willing to do this, because obviously Depp and Gilliam have been tight since Fear and Loathing, but apparently they only had Depp for like a day and a half, and all of his scenes had to be in one take because he had to get back to Public Enemies, and he had like a contractual obligation, and we managed to get the stuff out of him that we do. To the point that when we're first introduced to him, there's even like a sort of transitions our mind has to do, because he actually does look like him when he's revealed. Because I guess it's also sometimes when Ledger's wearing the mask, it's also a double as well. But it's like everything just feels so seamless, especially in these reveals, that it ended up being perfect. And Colin Farrell put it beautifully. I'm probably paraphrasing, but Colin Farrell said something along the lines of, it wasn't their job to step into Heath Ledger's shoes, it was their job to get those shoes across the finish line. Which is like this really beautiful way of saying, like, they didn't even have to... I think they were saying, like, they didn't even have to necessarily channel the character, just channel Ledger himself. And the whole thing that Terry Gilliam went into when he cast them was about... casting people who were friends of him and people that knew him personally. And I guess all three of them were friends with him in one way or another and had some sort of closeness to him in one way or another. Because apparently, Tom Cruise apparently got wind of this and really wanted involved in it. But Cruise didn't really know Ledger personally, and there wasn't really that sort of connection. So Gilliam actually had to turn him down because he really wanted it that sort of close-knit feel, and really give it that personal feel to it. So there was obviously the whole thing where they all gave their the money they made off the movie to his daughter to make sure she was secure, and then they all kind of got like the matching tattoos. And it was just this really sort of this emotional thing, and it was even to the point to where Gilliam says that like he almost gives Ledger credit for the whole movie itself, given all the directions and the chain reaction of events that happened to make this movie what it is now. And how like the whole thing is like it'd be, to put it mildly, to say it was a happy accident to this movie. But I do want to go more into that. But one of the things also I want to talk about is this movie does have some spectacular sets in it, particularly when we go inside the Imaginarium. Like I said, it becomes full on, almost like everything Gilliam was ever building to with his entire filmography. Where we've got all these set pieces that are they're based on like paintings, and they sort of like come to life in these ways that just kind of keeps going and going, whether it be the ladders or the gondola or anything like that. And it just kind of it goes into the whole imagination thing where once you take one step, you're just going to keep going until you're in probably a totally different place in a totally different setting, with things getting more and more sort of surreal as they go, as the imagination gets broader and broader as it goes, when you're building this sort of thing. But the thing also is that while I love that stuff, I do think both the best and the worst thing to happen to Terry Gilliam is CGI. Because we'll talk about this in the Brothers Grimm also. When I say one of the best things to happen to Gilliam is the fact that when you watch Gilliam's movies, stuff like, Barry Munchausen in Brazil and Time Bandits and stuff like that, stuff that felt brought to life in more of a practical way. You introduce CGI into this guy's imagination, and it's like now there's no holding back. It's like there is no limit to what they can accomplish now that CGI is a thing. But the thing about it is that it does look very... So like I said, as far as the settings go, there's some really spectacular looking stuff. But there's more so some moments, like individual moments, like whether it be a bird flying or child Garfield during the climax. There's a lot of CGI in this that doesn't quite work and does look extremely fake and does kind of pull you out of the really imaginative world that you're in. And it looks almost like incomplete. And it's... I don't know how well that's going to... I don't think it looked that great when the movie came out 10 years ago. And I fear that it's going to have a lasting impact on the movie itself only as time goes on. Because it is by no means flawless CGI. There's a particular, there's just not a crispness to it at all. And it feels like it's... I guess it just looks like it's in its early stages, and that sort of contradicts how great the sort of more massive stuff that they use the CGI for looks. But just a lot of those little individual things throughout just look so fake. And I understand, I'd almost buy the argument that maybe that's on purpose, because it's obviously this other, imaginative world. Because there's that world, and then there's the real world on the other side of the mirror, so I can kind of take it from that perspective, but still, it's just something that's always kind of bothered me, that CGI seems like it'd be the perfect thing for Gilliam because of just how far his imagination stretches and the kind of movies that he makes, and how you just have to have that constant thing. You need something that's going to make your ideas limitless and how you can put them on the screen. And CGI's just never really translated well to his movies as we see them. But I feel like they could in ways, and we certainly get some of that in the settings here, but I do think it sort of falls short a lot also. So, and it just sort of kind of doesn't capture the magic the same way his other more classic movies did, with more sort of practical approaches to it. So, yeah, we'll talk about more about that when we get into Brothers Grimm. But in the meantime, there's also something I almost forget about Dr. Parnassus until I watch it again, is I really love its dark sense of humor, which it kind of has throughout, which, like I said, some of the stuff that may seem like it's, bad on the surface feels almost intentional to the extent that you can just sort of see a dark sense of humor in it, but that's just some of it. Some of the other stuff would be like Ledger's character in general, the character of Tony in general, and the way he's sort of manipulating everybody. There's sort of especially in Ledger's performance, you can just sort of see like this sort of comedic dark twist he put into some of his line deliveries and some of the way he reacts to certain things, especially when we know his motives as it goes on. And then there's stuff like some of the lines, like when they first find him and he's hanging by a rope and he's hanging by his neck under the bridge. And Garfield's screaming, somebody get him a rope. And Vern Troyer says, well, if he's hanging by his neck, he's already got a rope, so he doesn't need stuff like that to give it that sort of nice little dark comedic twist. Always works really well, especially in Gilliam's movies also. And we'll talk about that in the Brothers Grimm as well. So yeah, but the main thing to go into with Dr. Parnassus, the thing that kind of makes it sort of stand above some of the things that are in the movie itself that kind of make it, go above what it may have been in other circumstances, is that it's one of those movies that's really just a miracle that it exists. And usually when I say something like that, it's to say, like, oh, they actually got this through the production company, somebody paid to put this on the screen, and it's there. But no, there are so many things, like so many almost other powers, like supernatural powers, that wanted this movie to not be made. Like, it's really, there is an eeriness to it. You can't deny it. Because Ledger was the star of the movie. And then we know what happened. And then, I think it was like 2 days after shooting, just as they were going to post-production, the producer died of cancer. So it's like they lose their producer just as they're going into post-production. And then somewhere in the middle of post-production, Terry Gilliam was hit by a car. And it's like, so they lost their star, they lost their producer, and they were uncomfortably close to losing their director in post-production. And this is probably before, like, some of the effect shots were handled in post also. So there was, and that's something that Terry Gilliam was talking about, where I was talking about how he said he gives Ledger a lot of credit for how this movie turned out, just given the circumstances. But it's like the whole thing where it's like I think what it was that Gilliam said was that he doesn't even give himself credit at all, like, and not even just Ledger, but like the seemingly outside invisible forces that were fucking with this movie in so many ways. Where it's like, and the other thing also that was kind of weird about them losing the producer was, I think Terry Gilliam's daughter had said that basically that producer's catchphrase was, if they've already shot it and it's already in the can, then everything will be fine. And it's like, to think that the guy that said that died right after they shot it. It's just so many things line up in so many weird ways that brought this movie to life. It's insane. It is insane that this movie got to where it was and is the movie that it is, because through all this stuff, you see this as production troubles and obstacles and all this stuff that was just raining shit on this production, and that an entirely new and different movie comes out of the other side, complete and done, and is the way that it is, and comes off still, like I said, gives the movie much more, like I said, a lot more layers, and just this whole thing where it's like, once you know the story, it's one of those cases where the story makes the movie even more impressive, as if it wasn't already to an extent. And it's, yeah, and then he was saying, like, Gilliam said the movie made itself, basically. And it's like, it's just so bizarre. It's really, really bizarre. And this is a guy that is, like, plagued all the time with this. We're going to go into production troubles that the Brothers Grimm had. There's the whole The Man Who Killed Don Quixote saga that lasted like 20 years, and then he finally got that made. Say what you will about Terry Gilliam, whether you like his movies or not, this motherfucker gets shit done. No matter how long it takes, no matter how many obstacles there are, no matter how many seemingly outside supernatural forces it takes, his movies will find their way to life, one way or the other, in the way that they are meant to be. And like I was saying, with this movie, the way the characters are represented, with Depp, Jude Law, and Colin Farrell coming and playing the other aspects of him, it seems like it was just meant to be that way. And we even have that scene at the beginning of the movie where the guy's face changes. It's like it was made for it. Now, mind you, I don't know exactly what all changes they made, after changes needed to be made. I know they had to do the whole thing where she sees Colin Farrell's likeness on, like, in the magazine or whatever. But, yeah, I mean, it really just came together in this really supernatural stars-aligning way. And it's crazy. It almost feels like the movie itself is a supernatural entity. And there it is. And it managed to score a couple of Oscar nominations while they were at it for costumes and production design, which, of course... And I think it was the first Gilliam movie to get Oscar nominations after 12 Monkeys, so that was like 14 years. So yeah, and it also scored too with Brad Pitt, and I think costumes as well. So yeah, so like I said, say what you will about the movie, there may be some things that don't quite stand up. But it's a Gilliam movie through and through. Like I said, it feels like, I guess you could say The Man Who Killed Don Quixote is the culmination of his work, but I think this would definitely have to be up there also. So yeah, so like I said, regardless of what you say about the movie, it's an incredible story, like its whole existence. And the more I watch the movie, the more I appreciate that. So, and all the other aspects of it that were already there also, but I mean, really, it's really just its own thing once you know its story. So, yeah. So as far as the Brothers Grimm goes, this is much more of like a studio movie. It's got a writer for hire in Aaron Kruger, who has the most stellar of writing credits to his name for sure. But Gilliam still managed to find his way in here, absolutely. But not without some trouble from studio heads. So, the thing about it is you go into it, and I'm sure I'll talk about this with Scary Stories later this week as well, but you hear about a movie called The Brothers Grimm coming out in 2005, and there's something that has always annoyed me with stuff like, you could say, like, maybe when Goosebumps came out, or, like I said, the upcoming Scary Stories movie that comes out Friday. These are movies and stories that lend themselves to the anthology treatment. And it always annoys me that they just, studios just refuse to go that route for some reason. Um, Now, mind you, there is a sort of anthology type movie around the Brothers Grimm with The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, which came out in like 1962, which is amazing, by the way. Like, I absolutely recommend that. It's got like Lawrence Harvey and Russ Tamblyn and a bunch of others in it, and it's an amazing movie. I love it. So I guess because that movie exists is why I'm not too pissed off that this is one of those movies that sort of takes its own approach and just kind of puts the stories in a little bit. And also, I think it's because the Grimm stories are stuff that we know, so we may not know necessarily the real stories well, but we know the vague outline of the stories well enough that maybe doing an anthology movie would have been a bit redundant. So to do it the way they did with this, where they were able to bring in Terry Gilliam's imagination, but also make kind of a big budget studio fantasy type movie and somehow combine them, I could see where that approach would be taken. So when it starts off, it is the pre-title sequence always did kind of bother me because it's so sort of odd. It's like an odd introduction because I guess it's building to show us the relationship between the two of them, particularly Will's relationship with how he feels about magic and supernatural and all that, and how he's against it and doesn't believe in it. And this whole segment where young Jacob comes and he's like sold the cow for the beans, of course, and Will freaks out and says, "This isn't gonna save our sister. Now she's going to die because you believe in magic." And that's it. Like, the way it builds up, it's like something really drastic is going to happen to kind of show, like, the magic. But it's to show that Will doesn't believe in magic. It's like the anti-setup of what you're anticipating, which I guess is something if that's what they were going for, but it still just feels like this really, opening, which is not the best start. You kind of want to pull your audience in on the first go, but there's still plenty of that to go around as the movie goes on. So we do start off, and I do like the way they set up the brothers basically being these con men, not too dissimilar to Tony, where they do the whole thing where they pretend to be the sort of like that era's Ghostbusters, I guess. But the difference being that, as we said, they're con men, so it's a whole setup. They've got a couple of actors with them. One of the guys plays a witch, and then they stop it, they get the money, they send the people on their way, and they're rich for basically just putting on a show. Well, not rich, but they've got money because they put on a show. But that is until they are found out by Jonathan Pryce, who feels like who's a welcome presence here because of the Brazil connection. Kind of feels like the gang's here a little bit. And Peter Stormare is in it as well, who would show up in Dr. Parnassus as the president in the Colin Farrell segment at the end. And Peter Stormare in particular is going full on Gilliam with this performance. He's right up in the camera's face, and he's just there's real Gilliam shots of him at the start of it, and then he's just going so far over the top through his entire screen time. You can't help but love it. Going over the top in that pure Peter Stormare way, with the combination of Gilliam, is kind of perfect. So, as this goes on, Jonathan Pryce says, instead of executing you, which is what I should do, I'm going to send you out to look for these missing children, and you're going to have to possibly deal with real magic for once, which Will still does not believe in, but will eventually. And of course, the children that are missing, some of them are just random farm kids or whatever, but then there's recognizable people coming in, like a girl in a red hood that may or may not being pursued by a wolf, and a boy and a girl named Hans and Greta. Yeah, so that's pretty much all the stories really come in. There's references here and there, obviously, but for the most part, that's the purpose that they serve. Is basically being MacGuffins to get them to go to all the different set pieces with all the heavy CGI and effects. So, and yeah, once again, well, I guess before Dr. Parnassus, CGI in Brothers Grimm has never really worked for me. It's especially weird in the first scene with the witch, because when she appears, it's a very, very CGI, fake-looking face. A lot of computer graphics going on here, which is really weird considering the reveal, where it's actually just an actor they've hired that works with them in actual makeup and prosthetics. So why would that be different when the characters and we as the audience at first think it's an actual witch? That doesn't really add up. And that's the first real instance we get of it. So that kind of leaves a sour taste before we've seen any of the other shitty CGI in this movie. Now, once again, you can maybe take the argument I was talking about with Dr. Parnassus. Maybe because of the fantastical element, it was supposed to look like that. But we'll kind of talk about that with the production troubles. Actually, we can go ahead and do that. Because apparently there was the whole thing where he was having trouble with the wine stains. So, like, I guess they wanted one thing, he wanted another. There were creative differences. And there was, like, so much of a problem here and so much of a gap in time between them getting figured out that Gilliam had time to go off and make Tideland, that movie with Jeff Bridges where he's like a decomposing corpse in the whole movie. And then he was able to come back and they were able to try to sort this out. And then I think that they had problems with another guy who was able to go off and do an entirely different movie then come back. So it was kind of a real clusterfuck, and you can tell that they kind of... And they had, like, they had to do more CGI than they thought they would. Like, there was supposed to be, like, I don't know, like 500 effects or something, and then there being 800 or something. So it's like they weren't exactly prepared for just how much effects they were going to need. And there was, like, a whole bunch of miscommunication and fighting going on, and it was... And you can kind of see where this maybe didn't come out the way he had hoped, which you give a studio movie to somebody like Terry Gilliam, you can imagine the studio is going to want to try to have their say to make it a bit more, I guess, mainstream. So you got stuff like the mud monster that turns into the gingerbread man that just looks nothing but fake as hell, and like an unfinished CGI product. But there's still, I mean, there is still something here. There's still definitely Gilliam's creativity coming through. One scene I've always really loved that really fits his imagination is the scene where the girl Elsie is eaten by the horse, and she like is pulling that like endless like webbing off of the horse's mouth, and it just gets more and more until it's like completely devours her, and then we get that shot where we like see her inside the horse's throat. And it's like that's the kind of stuff I feel like we're here for, not the CGI mud gingerbread man, whatever the fuck that was. Even the bugs running around look like fake CGI. And it really takes away from like the amazing production design, and just that stuff, that practical stuff that we know the movies like this really do well. But it's like he was trying to get as far away from that as possible, and we have these CGI creatures coming in, and it really sort of takes away from the effect that the rest of the movie is doing right, and really seems to capture the feel. And that's the frustrating thing about this movie, is I feel like the movie this was probably supposed to be in Gilliam's mind, you can see it in there. There's just a bunch of studio stuff in the way. And you're like trying to see past it, but you can only get so far. So apparently this was really hard on the climax also, with Monica Bellucci in the mirror, where that was a lot more CGI than they had initially intended, because it was so, you had to get so individual with like the glass shards and stuff like that. So I guess, in a sense, that they were kind of setting themselves up to fail a little bit in the effects department, so there is that. But there is still some stuff in this movie that I like quite a bit. I do love the chemistry between Damon and Ledger. It's definitely just enough for you to have really wished we would have gotten to see them work together again, like this closely. But there is a problem, though, as good as their chemistry is. There does seem to be like constant character inconsistencies, because when we do start off, we do realize that they're like con men, but then, and that's kind of the way they play it up. Damon in particular, I really love his line when he's in denial when he's seeing all the magic. He's seeing the trees come to life, and he's seeing everything come to life around him, and he just says, "These people are much better funded than we are." So the stuff like that really works. But then you've got these contrasting personalities that the brothers have, where, yes, they're the con men, but then sometimes it's like they're, these heroic types that'll just run right into danger. Then there's other times where they're just bumbling idiots. And these are just kind of interchangeable throughout the entire movie. There's definitely an inconsistency there, which they do those things well when like they're asking for that particular thing, but it's like, because it's just constant bouncing around, it doesn't work as well as it should as far as them as the characters themselves. But in each individual moment, they can make it work, because they're Matt Damon and Heath Ledger, and they're amazing, especially together. So there is that. But and another thing about that particular, I was talking about the Damon line, was something that you would think maybe wouldn't fit, but actually does, because it's consistent. I just talking about how the inconsistency doesn't work, and then this is how consistency does work, and that is the tone, and the fact that this movie is very comedic. Like, the movie is practically a comedy. It's got some of this, freaky imagery. They got to do, the Brothers Grimm style and all that. So there's going to be that, and it's going to be like really fantastical and all that, and sort of have this almost like a horror vibe to it, almost. But there is a comedic tone that is consistent through the whole thing. So like anytime something comedic happens, it doesn't feel like comedy relief. It just feels like part of the movie. Like it's just another, part of the movie's personality. So it never feels like tonally out of place when something comedic happens. Notice I'm dodging the word funny and saying comedic, because sometimes they get there, sometimes maybe not so much. But, yeah, so that's, yeah, and also, sometimes there's really, like I say comedic, like sometimes it's slapsticky, and sometimes there's those moments where, like, when Damon's kind of building up, that they're gonna, run into battle and they're gonna do this thing, and then he says that he'll need a god, and when he says that, the triumphant score just cuts off into silence. So it's like, it's not like underlying humor. It is like a flat-out comedic moments. And it's really impressive to me that they're able to juggle the tones enough that those never really feel out of place, because they're always there from the get-go, and that's just part of it. So I did like that they were able to pull that off, at least. But, yeah, so as imaginative as it can be, and I've heard that praise thrown at it a lot. But by Gilliam standards, it's incredibly underwhelming. Like, so incredibly underwhelming by Gilliam standards. And it's like, there's certain moments where you can really absolutely point out that it's a Gilliam movie. Other times, you wouldn't be able to tell at all. So it's like, I could see them have it's in Gilliam's hands, but I can imagine that if it didn't end up in Gilliam's hands, it'd probably just be some director for hire. Like, this is a movie that was going to get made either way, and we're just lucky enough that it was in Gilliam's hands, so we got to see at least a little bit of what a great version of this would have been. But it only feels like it's sort of here and there, and a lot of times in the background. Like the whole trees thing feels like it should have been a lot more creative, but it just kind of feels like almost background noise. But some of that stuff is in there, and yeah, once it gets to like the last half hour, I tend to find it more exciting and more engaging throughout. And it is a movie that I have come back to at least a couple of times because it's a movie that I really want to like, and I feel like it's one of those movies where at some point I might more so. I mean, it's fine as is, but I feel like I could like it more if it kind of grows on me more. So I do find myself occasionally going back to it, maybe like once every few years, but still, I'm still hoping I can see something in it eventually, but right now, it just kind of is what it is. It's a Terry Gilliam movie, but more so a studio movie. So needless to say, I would pick Dr. Parnassus in a landslide, even if I'm not even Dr. Parnassus' biggest fan. It's just a movie I admire so much for how they managed to get it to the point that they got it to. And so, yeah, I think that's about all I can really say about these. So I'm not sure what the next one is going to be, but there will be a review video of the Dora movie, the Scary Stories movie, and The Kitchen. So whatever video I decide, we'll go with that. So until all that, I think that's it.